Aren't you glad you came this morning? We could go home now, couldn't we? That's so encouraging. I want just to welcome you, and I want to welcome those of you who will be and are joining us online and on the live stream. And I want to welcome you if you're in the building as well. You're welcome too. So, I come this morning as the bearer of bad news and good news. The bad news is that last week we were at the end of the world and the end of Revelation. So no more Revelation. The good news, we've still got to cover the rest of the Bible. So there's plenty of good stuff from God's Word. Today is Advent. It's the moment when the church's focus turns towards the once and the future coming of King Jesus. And so we're going to dig into our Christmas theme, that theme of the thrill of hope. I'm going to do that as we look at Isaiah chapter 9. So we're in the Old Testament this morning, Isaiah chapter 9, and a very familiar passage, I'm sure, for many of us at this time of year. Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 1. There will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the future, he will honor Galilee of the Gentiles by the way of the sea along the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation, and you've increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people who rejoice at the harvest, as men rejoice when they're dividing plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdened them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. For every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning. They will be fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And join with me. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Amen. Our Christmas theme this year comes from the carol Holy Night. And we sing in that carol these words: a thrill of hope. The weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and a glorious morn. I don't know about you, but I'm going to find singing these words very challenging this year. Because as we look around our lives and our world, it is all too difficult to find anywhere to place our hope and our expectations. Let me remind you, on October the 7th, the terrorist group Hamas broke through the fences, penning them into Gaza, unleashed unspeakable atrocities on the Israeli population. I don't need to remind you that Israel's response has been shocking in its scope and in its scale. And maybe like me, you're asking, where is the thrill of hope in Gaza today? Where is hope for children seeking safety, security, and a future? That is to make no political point other than to lament the brutality of human beings. And I could go on to speak of personal losses people have faced, injuries and injustices, but you know the score. And like me, I imagine that many of us are casting around the rubble of broken dreams, shattered expectations. We're searching for hope amongst the rubble. Fragments that we might find to build some kind of appetite for engagement, for action. Something to build faith even for prayer. Maybe you're asking, how indeed can this weary world rejoice? Hope needs more than a fridge magnet, doesn't it? Hope needs more than some vapid, trivial platitude. Hope needs something solid to stand on. And Isaiah 9 brings us, I believe, to a solid foundation for hope. And that's where we're going to look today. And we begin with people walking in darkness. That's really where the season of Advent begins. It begins with people walking in darkness. And I'm going to ask 3 questions this morning to help us through this text. The first question is, who are these walkers in darkness? Who are these people who see a great light? The truth of the matter is that for Isaiah's first audience, they were walking in darkness. The people of God were staggering around in a post-traumatic stress and shock of a national disaster. The Assyrian Empire, fearful in its might, had engulfed the north of the land. The lands of Naphtali and Zebulun had been overrun. And the consequences for the people were tragic. They were deeply personal. Here were individuals, people who had been slaughtered, others who had been abducted, never to be seen again, and families that had been broken apart, never to be repaired. They were living with a deeply personal trauma. They were also living with a profoundly shameful state of mind. Isaiah 9 verse 1 tells us that these were people who were humbled. Perhaps better still, we might translate that belittled. They were reduced in their standing and in their sense of honor. And the problem these people faced was fundamentally theological. God had not been there for them, had not protected them at their time of tragedy. Now, my plan today is not to depress you with more darkness, but we need to outline the scope of the dark, simply because we need to be reminded that whatever the darkness, it is accessible to God. And wherever you find yourself in your mental state or your present experience of life, God can and will access that darkness. Psalm 139 verse 12 says, even darkness is not dark to you. So let me outline what these people were facing. They were facing a darkness that was the consequence of present anxiety. In verse 1, we read about those who were in distress. And this kind of translates a strange word which means both restriction and anguish. It was actually a word that was used to describe frozen water, ice. And what's being described here is a people who are psychologically immobilized, stuck, unable to decide how to act or to move forward. They were in distress. They were paralyzed by shock and fear. They were also paralyzed by the darkness of death. We read in verse 2, second half, that these people were living in the land of the shadow of death. And this is a phrase or a word that is used in Psalm 23 verse 4. It's an expression you will know of from there that we often describe as the valley of the shadow of death. So here were people who were living with the consequences of loss and grief and death. Loss affects all of us. In fact, I have lost count of the number of people I have encountered this year who have faced significant loss in their lives. Loss of health, loss of loved ones, loss of many different kinds. They were overshadowed by death. And I want just to read for you a moment, part of a poem by Kathy Galloway. It's a poem I think that actually helps to describe and validate our sense of loss. She says this, describing a loss in her life. There is nothing, she says, to compare with the pain of death. You were here, and now you are not. That's all. I searched for you in old photographs, letters, things you have touched, things that remind me of you. They cannot fill the space you occupied. That space is in me too, bleeding round the edges where you were torn away. In the night, strange shapes haunt the space. Regret, fear, fury. All the things we might have done. All the shattered dreams. How can I go on with this hole inside? I am diminished without you. Here were people who could speak these words, know these words, and feel it. The darkness existed in the shadow of death. And then, just finally to describe this darkness was also a darkness that trapped people, immobilized people in a place of death. In chapter 8, you can read it for yourself. In this account, people are consulting mediums, intent on connecting with the dead. Perhaps these are family members or friends. And what we're being reminded of here is that when hope is vanquished from our lives, we get stuck. When hope is vanquished with our lives, we feel the emptiness. When hope disappears from our lives, we are trapped in the past, unable to go forward. Without hope, we are imprisoned. Without hope, it's as if something has already died. Lewis Smedes says, hope is to our spirits what oxygen is to our lungs. Lose hope and you die. They may not bury you for a while, but without hope, you are dead inside. Hope is the beginning of healing. Hope is the beginning of transformation. So let me turn to hope. Second question that this passage asks is, what is the light? What happens in this prophetic word is that people in darkness experience an explosion of light and life. People walking in darkness see a great light. It's a light that comes from God himself. And it reminds us that our God is an invader of worlds. Now, this might be the most obvious point in the passage this morning, but it's essential that we grasp it. You and I don't make the light. We cannot. The whole Old Testament tells us there's actually no answer to our human condition, to our state of affairs from inside. We cannot pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We can't talk ourselves into hope. We can't G one another up into a state of euphoria that has any sense. We need help from the outside. And the wonder and the joy of Christian faith is that God in Jesus does for us what we cannot do for ourselves. He acts to break the power of darkness. He acts to win forgiveness. He acts to atone for our sins. And it begins here with a word from heaven for people who do not yet see the darkness overcome. It's a word of prophecy. It's a word of promise. In fact, this word is written in the past tense. And it's a word about a future promise. That's how sure and certain is the word of God. That when God speaks truth into our world and lives, he speaks in such a way that it's already a done deal. It's already a completed act. And our hope is centered in what God has done. In Jesus, it's done. He is an invader into our world, his world. But he is also the giver of life. This word promises that God will enlarge the nation, restore their honor, bring celebration like at harvest time or in a victory feast. God comes to be a giver of life. And somehow, somewhere, that reality so easily evaporates from our minds. We need to remind ourselves constantly that the hand that moves history is a hand that is kind and that is loving. That God's purposes are not for our diminishing, but for our flourishing. God's intent is for life. And you don't have to go very far to discover that God's plan for this planet and for our lives is sometimes painted with the colors of torment and terror, as if God's primary characteristic was to smite people. And some of us, as a consequence, can only see God as a killjoy, as a restrictor of life. And people around us are hesitant about Christian faith because they see Christian faith as a constraint, something that is uncreative and fights against our internal creativity, or a restriction on women's rights or whatever it might be. And let's face it, there are some Christians that confirm these prejudices. But God's promise is of light and of life. God comes to enable human beings to flourish in a way that nothing else on this planet will enable us to do. He comes to bring life in its fullness, in all its fullness, in harmony with our Creator and King, the way it is intended to be. And may it be that each of us would bring something of that life and not be a bringer of death in the relationships that we have. And then thirdly, we see here that this light indicates that God is a harbinger of peace. Every boot that marches and shakes the earth, every garment that's dragged through blood is used as fuel for the fire. You see, God's promise is not just that he would be like, the best peace negotiator in the world has ever known. God's promise is that he will eliminate the causes of conflict, violence, and war. That he will eliminate that from our souls as well as from our societies. And I don't know whether you would agree with me, but it seems to me that our human failure to function speaks most clearly and loudly in the arena of violence, abuse, and war. It indicates how corrupted we human beings are. But God has promised he will destroy not just war, but the reasons for war, the weapons of warfare. And he will bring all things to peace. I don't know about you, but I'm not particularly good at peacemaking or conflict resolution. My family background led me to believe that conflict was ultimately hard to resolve, and that probably the best way to deal with conflict was to avoid the issue altogether, and that a long, slow, unresolved Cold War is probably the best way of dealing an argument in the family. Maybe you were like that. But here's the encouragement. God's kingdom, God's heart, is to push us towards reconciliation and relationship. That means when we step out to fix something, the power of God is behind it. When we step out in faith to make things right, it's the wind of God's kingdom is behind us. The guys were saying this morning, it's really hard to play without a drummer because a drummer keeps everybody together. Now, some of you think a drummer is just somebody that likes to hang out with musicians. But drummers are, and they aren't here this morning, don't tell them I said that. But they know I've told them that joke. But you need a drummer to bring a rhythm and a togetherness to a band. And without that beat that brings unity, it is hard to function. Just ask Nikki after the service. And God is like a heavenly drummer that is beating a beat of peace and resolution of conflict. He is drawing us together. He is harmonizing us in his heart. And he does it not by the exercise of coercive force or power, bashing our heads together. He does it by the giving of a fragile child who will become a frail human being, who will give his life for the forgiveness of all mankind. He does it, we're told, in the way of Midian's defeat. Go and look at Judges 6 and 7. Midian was defeated because God's people gave up their arms and their power as Gideon gave himself to trust in the Lord. It's the way of the Lamb. It's God's way of bringing peace. It's of a life laid down, a child in a manger, and a man on a cross, nailed in weakness, overcome by darkness. The writer Barbara Brown Taylor said, whether it's a seed in the ground, a baby in the womb, or Jesus in the tomb, it starts in the dark, and it starts in frailty, and it starts with his promise. So we've asked, what is the darkness? Who walks in the darkness? We've asked, what is the light? And I want just to finish by asking the question, what child is this? It's where this whole promise, this whole prophecy is going. In verse 9, light appears and we see the reality of that light. We see what that light contains. Unto us. Right? Get this? Here's the thing. This gift of light and life and hope eternal is unto us. Unto us. You see, God didn't just write a letter of condolence to the human race from heaven. Really sorry you're messed up, but, you have my thoughts. God comes to us. God steps into the mess. God becomes fragile in person, in humanity. You wouldn't send a child to Gaza this week, but God sent his one and only Son into the whole world, into every Gaza, into every chaos, into every damaged relationship. This is our God. He is the seeking Father. It's not just a nice thing to describe about him. In his essential nature, God is one who seeks that which is lost. God is a shepherd going after that one last lost sheep. That's who he is, was, and always shall be, giving of himself to us and for us. And ultimately that he might give himself to us on the cross. At that point where all the darkness of all the ages congealed in one pure, evil, destructive force. And he bears it. He comes that he might take responsibility for the darkness. Even more than that he would shoulder the darkness. Even more than that, he would be like the scapegoat into which we nail all our complaints and offenses, all our evil and our abuses. Unto him, unto us, a child has been given. This is our God. And so he is a wonderful counselor. Now, you need to know that this is not his counseling registration, describing ultimate outstanding credentials as a counselor. That's not the point. Wonderful suggests the source of his ability to give guidance and advice. It's the same kind of way in which we think about a wonder and a sign and a miracle. A wonder means something that comes from heaven to earth. That's not the consequence of our education or our experience. It's a breaking in of the gift and reality of God. Now, we live in a world that could be defined by its moral relativism. I've been reading a brilliant article by James Mumford, who is the other Mumford son, in a brilliant, very personal essay about his own mental health. You'll find it in the Atlantic newspaper or online this week. But he describes a whole society based on the premise that we can and should make up all our own values and live by them. That's, he said, what everybody imagines just to be normal. And we even accept that those values can be different and contradictory. It's like, we're living in a society where we're a number of different football teams, and we all get to make up the rules. And there's no FIFA to decide who was right. Some people just pick up the ball and run with it. Why not? Because that's how I feel about things. and I just want to express my feelings. Of course, it gets worse than that. Your value might be, well, I like to murder people. That's who I am. I'm just being authentic. Where do we say that that is wrong unless there is a standard, there is a belief system that we agree and that comes from beyond ourselves? Wonderful Counselor tells us that God sets the standards, that there is good and evil, and that God expresses and affirms the value of good over evil. That there are values that we can share together in order that we might live in harmony in the world, in order that we might manage evil and deliver the good. He is a wonderful Counselor. Our truth, our lives come from beyond ourselves. And this child is the mighty God. It's an incredible claim, isn't it? Mighty God means in Hebrew, mighty God. It's as clear as day. God the Creator, contained in the fragility of this baby. I love Pete Gregg's description of this in his book, Dirty Glory. So let me quote it. He says, "This is our claim. This is our Christian creed. The blasphemous glory of Emmanuel. Omnipotence surrendering to incontinence. The name above every other name, rumored to be illegitimate. The Holy One of Israel, with dirt in the creases of his hands." Isn't that wonderful? He is the mighty God, and he is the everlasting Father. He's eternally fatherly in his approach to us. We place hope not in a heavenly hard man who will bash us all together and beat us into submission. Not even in a heavenly lawyer who will arbitrate and negotiate between the nations, but one who intends to treat us personally like a father. Astonishing. It's the unique claim of Christian faith that we can know God as Father, relationally, personally, wonderfully. He is the everlasting Father, and he's the Prince of Peace. He's that champion of healing and wholeness. His intention, his agenda, his plan is to make all things well, to bring all things in heaven and on earth under his shalom, his healing, his wholeness, his well-being. And he will do it through this child. We read in 1 Corinthians 15:28, when he's done this, the Son himself, this child, will be made subject to God the Father and put everything under him so that God may be all in all. This is where it's going, folks. This is the plan that God has. This is the plan that was exercised when he placed his Son in that manger in Bethlehem. It is this plan that he promised to Isaiah in the midst of darkness. It is this plan that Jesus Christ implemented. It is this plan that won the day when Christ was crucified and resurrected from the dead. And this is our hope, that he will begin what he has started. That he will finish what he started. And that at Christmas time, we remember he has started it. And I want to suggest that in the midst of these challenges that we face, that we take hold of truth, stubborn, defiant truth, truth that stands on the prophetic promises of God and takes hold of the promise that he will complete what he has begun. We will find our lives mired by gloom. We will have stuff that comes at us from every direction. But our vision, our perspective, is on the one who is our coming King, who has made all things right, and who will one day be Lord and ruler over all. And so we say and we sing, "Come thou long expected Jesus, born to set thy people free. From our fears and sins release us. Let's find our rest in thee, our strength, our consolation, hope of all the earth thou art, dear desire of every nation, joy of every longing heart." Today we're going to take communion together in just a moment. Nick is going to come, I think, and lead us just as we prepare the table. And just as we do that, we're going to serve at stations. But when we take the bread and wine, it speaks of many things. And it will speak to you in your particular situation today. But I just want to suggest that as we struggle to have hope, that we simply just take the bread and wine today. If this is helpful for you, then I just encourage you to do this and just say, Jesus, you are my hope. I place my trust in you. This is where I stand. On this, what you have done and what you promise will come. And I trust that that will be helpful for us as we just seek to take what he has said to us in his word on board this morning. So why don't we stand together as we worship him.